So this morning I'll be providing a summary of harvest in the sport and commercial fisheries in Lake Superior on behalf of the Lake Superior Technical Committee. A few years back, at the request of the Lake Committee, the Tech Committee has been pulling together harvest information and reporting out annually on that. Basically, we're looking at both the recreational and the commercial harvest provided by states, tribes, and provinces, or the province of Ontario, and looking at it at the scale of the Lake Trout Management Unit, nothing finer than that. We request the information, just sending out a template and doing some minor cleanup, and then summarize that information into a report or presentations like this. There are situations where the data come in as dressed pounds, or in the case of a creel survey, are numbers of fish, and everything is converted to round pounds. So all the information you'll see in the plots is round pounds. Also, a few other things to note: subsistence harvest is included, but it's not explicitly it's not explicitly charted anywhere. It's combined with state and tribal commercial fisheries as in one data source. Commercial harvest also combines a number of different types of gears: trap nets, large mesh gill nets, small mesh gill nets across the board. As far as the recreational fishery is concerned, a couple things to note. Creel surveys are not conducted in Ontario waters, so really everything that we look at today with sport harvest is really on the U.S. side. And then also note that these creel surveys do vary somewhat from one jurisdiction to another, and so some of the cross-jurisdiction comparisons, let's not get bogged down in like exact numbers. It's sort of looking at the broader trends. And I think it's fair to say that most of the creel surveys are aimed to estimate lake trout abundance in the creel fishery or in the sport fishery. And so that may come at a cost to some of the other species that we also report out on. Something like a yellow perch is maybe underrepresented in some of the creels. And so this has allowed us to maintain a harvest database that is utilized for various purposes, but generally for this report out. So the first plot is all harvest of all species that we request across both the recreational and sport fishery. Interesting to see that in 2020, that was basically the lowest level of harvest in the time series since 1995, but we've seen a rebound since then in both the commercial and the sport fishery. This plot is intentionally busy. First, to show you all the species that we request information on, but also to point out that really there's three main players in terms of harvest in the lake, and that's Cisco, lake whitefish, and lean lake trout. The Cisco is in the orange, lake whitefish is in blue, and then lean lake trout is in gray. It's an overwhelming majority of the harvest of those three species. Looking at the information sort of spatially in the last year that we have available, which is 2024, I didn't mention, but we sort of have a lag in the data set. So the last year in the data set is 2024, not 25. But looking at that spatially for lean lake trout, you can see the darker the green, the greater the extraction, right? So some areas that had the highest extraction for lake trout really were WI2, which is the Apostle Islands region, MI4, which is Keweenaw Bay and eastern portion of Keweenaw Peninsula, and then MI8, which includes Whitefish Bay area. Looking at the same sort of depiction for Cisco, a little different picture where predominantly the harvest is taking place in the western arm of Lake Superior, WI2, the Apostle Islands, and then Minnesota waters, as well as Thunder Bay. Obviously, there's some harvest that takes place in eastern Michigan waters, but not anywhere near the same scale. For lake whitefish, looks a bit more similar to lake trout, where some of the key areas are the Apostle Islands region in Wisconsin, MI4, and then MI8. But you can see there's harvest in almost all the units. I didn't mention for lake trout, just as an aside, MI1, which is Isle Royal, didn't actually depict any harvest. There is harvest there, but the creel surveys there are conducted really I think it's every 10 years or so, maybe even less often than that. So we just didn't have information. Doesn't mean there isn't harvest that takes place there for lake trout and other species. So looking at commercial species specifically, the Cisco in sort of that red, lake whitefish in green, and lean lake trout in blue. We'll look at the trends from the beginning of the time series that's available to us, which is beginning in 1995. Cisco, you can see there was the highest level of extraction was really around the 2010, 11, 12 time period, where a whole fish market really propped up greater harvest, especially in the Wisconsin area. And then it's been more flat since then at a lower level. Lake whitefish, since a low in 2020, has sort of steadily increased, as well as lean lake trout, kind of the same pattern where we were at a 30-year low, and then it's steadily increased. If we break that down more by jurisdiction, you get a little bit more of the nuance of what's going on there. And I will note that the X or the Y-axes on these plots are different for the species, right? And it's to be able to look at trends across the jurisdictions for each species, not across species per se. But you see for Cisco, overwhelmingly the amount of harvest that comes out of Wisconsin waters. And yet in other areas, it's been more flat, if not slowly declining, say like in Ontario. Lake whitefish is a different picture where in two different jurisdictions, we've seen that increase since 2020 in the commercial fishery for whitefish, both in Michigan and Wisconsin. Lean lake trout, kind of similar, where more so in Michigan waters, there's been a gradual increase since 2020 in commercial harvest of lean lake trout, and a bit more, I'd say, just flatter in some of the other areas where it's pretty consistent amount of harvest that takes place over time. Looking at species that are targeted in the recreational fishery, lean lake trout are still a big player in that, but now we look at things like other trout, which include brown trout, splake, rainbow trout, and then salmon, which is predominantly coho salmon, but also Chinooks and pink salmon in some years are part of that. You can see the trends. Similar to the commercial fishery, lean lake trout have increased the last few years in the sport harvest as well. Other trout, which it's a mix, but a lot of times it is brown trout in say like Wisconsin waters, increased pretty gradually over time, and then has been sort of at a flat levels probably since about 2017-ish time frame. Salmon, which are almost exclusively not stocked, are all naturalized fish in the system, are more sporadic, and probably a lot of that sporadic nature has to do with conditions in the lake or flood conditions when those fish get exported into the lake. We'll dig down a little bit into maybe why some of those long-term spikes took place when we look at it by jurisdiction here. So lean lake trout, a lot of the increase that we've seen in the sport harvest isn't just, it's in Michigan waters and in Minnesota in the last few years, whereas Wisconsin has been flatter over the time period. Other trout, generally, especially considering the spatial extent of Wisconsin waters where they're stocked, that's predominantly the brown trout stocking that takes place in the Apostle Islands region. And that increased pretty rapidly at one point and now has been fairly flat over time. Salmon is, like I said, even amongst the various jurisdictions, more sporadic in terms of the harvest from one year to the next. What's interesting is you see in Michigan in 2023, that giant spike in the total harvest. That wasn't necessarily a huge change in the numbers of fish captured. It's the average size of fish just exploded with the boom of Cisco that moved into the system. The average size of fish, it's not really as well depicted in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but the same phenomenon took place where the fish were double, triple the size of them. I think Minnesota set some state records that year. And so they responded immediately to that influx of small Cisco. But since that time have returned back to their kind of normal average size as the Cisco have grown past the gape limitations of small salmon. So the next few slides are just single species look. We've kind of looked at lean lake trout again, but being such a major player in the system, I thought it would be interesting just, again, look at it across recreational, commercial, and unlike any of the other species, it's much closer to being, it's not a 50-50 split, but there's a much higher proportion of the total harvest in the recreational fishery. And again, on a lake-wide basis, have seen this increase in the last few years. Ciscoette lake trout are not necessarily targeted in sport and commercial fisheries, but are certainly captured. And you can see how that the dynamics kind of changed in the early 2000s, where it has increased and been somewhat stable since then. Um, Probably different mechanisms. There's marketability for small ciscoettes in the commercial fishery, in the sport fishery. Some of this is probably just due to sport anglers not necessarily knowing that they're harvesting or bringing home ciscoettes, as opposed to lean lake trout. So, but still interesting to see the fishery is sort of paralleled what we think the dynamics of the population is out there, where it's been relatively stable over the last almost 20 years. Another species that's gaining a lot more attention, especially more so in the recreational fishery, is burbot. Seeing changes in how they're viewed in inland fisheries, but I'd say it certainly could be the case in Lake Superior as well, where certain years you see a pretty high proportion of fish being kept in the recreational fishery. I'm speculating the commercial fishery, they were being captured probably over the time series at similar rates, but there's a greater marketability for them at this point, where people are actually seeking out burbot on the menu, or seeing it at a fish house and actually purchasing it at a greater rate than they did historically. Walleye harvest. This one's a bit interesting because the walleye fisheries are they're sort of generally related to large tributaries. It doesn't represent anything from on the recreational side, doesn't represent anything that's happening in Ontario as well. But a lot of these trends that you see here are driven by the western arm of the lake, and it's the St. Louis River population that's, I wouldn't even say gradually, has increased pretty rapidly over time. And those fish are being captured out in the lake more often, and so it's kind of reflected. It's a bit noisy, but you can see if you squint your eyes, there's this increasing trend, certainly, in walleye harvest. Last one I'm reporting out. I'm not sure what to make of this one. I do know, it's yellow perch they're kind of restricted to these embayment areas, at least for the sport fishery. They're just not a focus of many of our fisheries anymore. That time period, the early time period, going back and looking at that, it's almost exclusively Ontario harvest in the commercial fishery, and that has obviously changed since about 2002. So as I wrap up, I guess I would just always caution folks when we make too much of the harvest trends, because we're not incorporating effort. And so it's interesting to look at the trends, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that there's been these broad scale changes in catch rates, which would actually have a greater relationship to what's happening in the populations for some of these species. But nevertheless, lake trout have the harvest in itself has increased across multiple jurisdictions and multiple fisheries over the last 3 or 4 years. Commercial whitefish also has increased since 2010 or 2020, which was a good sign. That prior to that, it was sort of looking like this long-term decline, which we were a bit concerned about. Reported Cisco harvest. We haven't seen the levels that were observed back in 2012. Whether that's a good thing or not, I think it'll be interesting to see when this most recent gigantic Cisco year class fully recruits to the commercial gear. My understanding is that their growth rates seem to be a bit slower than previous cohorts, and they're probably not even fully recruited to the commercial gears yet. So we'll see what effect it has. Although the Cisco fishery, as many of you know, isn't always driven by abundance. It's also the market and the price that folks are getting per pound. And then I think part of this larger story of how the Cisco boom has affected Lake Superior, that incredibly rapid increase in the average size of salmon was interesting to note. In a system that is forage limited, oligotrophic, as soon as there was a lot of forage there, it was an immediate impact on a species that has a really short life history, but again have returned back to sort of average size now, and that's because that the small forage is not necessarily available like it was just a few years ago. And then certainly of note to keep an eye on these burbot and walleye fisheries as they gain popularity in Lake Superior. Obviously, I'm not saying that walleye fisheries weren't already popular, but certainly in Lake Superior and some of these places like the Western Arm, that those fisheries continue to grow. If you're interested in looking at some of this information in more detail, we post this report, this information via report on the GLFC website. QR code should hopefully take you to the website where you can find the most recent report. And with that, I'll open it up to questions or comments.